Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatorian. Now, as many of you know, I have a great interest, as well as in European arms, also in Indian weapons specifically. And I've spoken in the past quite a few times actually about the pata. Some people would refer to this as the Dan pata. I'll just call it a pata in English literature and indeed in Indian books as well. These are just generally referred to as a pata, sometimes just referred to as a gauntlet sword. These seem to have become popular in India in the 17th century and were used both on foot and on horseback. Now, lots of things are said about these. Lots of people seem to confuse this with the urumi because some of these do have quite flexible blades. It does seem there are regional differences. This example actually has a relatively stiff blade. As noted in a book, which I'm going to show you in a second, many of these blades, as I've noted in my previous videos, were European, and in fact sometimes on these blades, on antique examples in museums in India and all over Europe and in America, we find that the markings on the blade demonstrate that the blades are of European manufacture. And we know from the records in India that in the 17th century huge numbers of European blades were being imported into the country, and there are records from armories, for example in Lucknow, where we know that they had thousands of European blades in storage ready to be hilted up with Indian hilts, and they could come in many different forms. Now I'm just going to take this off my hand for a second. They could be mounted, for example, with the typical kind of tolwar hilt. Although we wouldn't call it a tolwar if it had a straight blade on it, we'd probably call it a farangi if it was a European blade, or if it was a forward curved blade, a Susan pata, something like this. So the different names for the different Indian swords are a little bit subjective. Sometimes they refer more to the hilt, sometimes they refer more to the blade, but usually they refer more to the blade. And generally speaking, farangi, which just literally means Frankish, let's say European, so that's something that's a sort of hangover from Persian influence. So within Persia and the Middle East, it became common in the medieval period to refer to Europeans as Franks, and this came into Indian language as the word farangi, which just means Frankish or foreigner in a sense. And these European blades were imported in huge numbers. Now, one thing I want to say about the pata before I just refer to this book in a second is that something I've noted as somewhat strange about these is if they have a very flexible blade, then understandably they're not going to be any good for thrusting, because for thrusting effectively you need a blade that you can have some flex, but if it's too flexible you're not going to get any kind of good penetration, and we need good penetration with a thrusting weapon. But if it has a relatively stiff blade that you could stab with it, it does seem that in India these were still predominantly seen as cutting swords. So much so that we actually have records in British sources from the 19th century when, of course, India was part of the British Empire. There are descriptive accounts of people using these patas for sword feats, as they were known in Britain. That is, demonstrations of skill using swords. And in fact, these got imported into British culture as well, with sabres and specialised types of swords in Britain. But in India, there were indigenous cutting feats or sword feats, should we say, some of which have survived to the modern day. The sword swallowing thing, that even when I was a kid, that was something that magicians sometimes demonstrated, sword swallowing, that comes from India. But there were lots of cutting feats that were particular to India. One of those, for example, was known as the Sir Charles Napier feat, and it was where a willing assistant would have usually a lemon, it could be some other kind of fruit, on the palm of their hand, and the skilled swordsman would chop through the fruit so that it fell in two halves, but they wouldn't cut the person's hand. This is in technical terms, this is relatively simple, because all you have to do is you have to chop through the fruit, but make sure you deliver no push or pull. So therefore you're not going to cut the skin, but you will split the fruit. Now, whilst that's simple on paper, it does take a great amount of skill to do that without actually cutting the person's hand. And this was transferred over into British martial arts in the sword feats that you can see, for example, in John Musgrave Waite's manual, in the second half of the manual. But in India, they had many other sword feats. For example, slicing a egg, hard-boiled egg, without breaking the, or rather not without breaking, but without shattering the edges of the shell, so the shell was sort of cleanly severed, as it were. But these pata were used in their own sword feat, and one of the things they used to do, and these are described in 19th century sources, but they're still done today in parts of India, usually with a very flexible bladed version of this, but it does seem they used stiffer blades. On the original antique ones tend to have stiffer blades than the modern replicas. Much like in Chinese martial arts, don't always assume that the weapon used in the modern martial art is very similar to the weapon used historically. So it does seem that in certain modern Indian martial arts displays, they're using weapons which are almost like exaggerated versions of the historical ones. If we look at the ones in museums, whilst they do have somewhat flexible blades, they tend not to be as flexible and as exaggerated and as long as the modern martial arts versions are. For example, they pretty much all have blades of this kind of length, up to about 40 inches, but some of the modern ones used for demonstration have like urumi blades, great big long ones. Anyway, and one of the common sword feats done with these patas is for a volunteer to have a fruit, usually a lemon, underneath the foot, could be a lime or anything else really, under their foot, and then the person using the pata does lots of spinning around and then slices the fruit underneath the person's foot, obviously without hitting them in the foot. And it's very difficult because it's very low to the ground. You use the flex of the blade somewhat, but you have to get low, and of course you have to get the angle right so you don't hit the person in the foot, because that would be somewhat embarrassing. So what I really wanted to say, that's just a little bit of background there about Indian martial arts, a little bit about British martial arts, a little bit about European blades being imported into India. But what I really wanted to say was about the pata. If you look at it just as an object, just take my hand out again, it's a bit of a palaver, it looks like it might be a thrusting weapon. It's a straight blade, it's got a point, but if you actually think about a thrust going into a target, a body, or anything else, you have to get it out again. Now, these weapons are shown used, as I said, on horseback and on foot. Now, on horseback, you can use the movement of the horse, the momentum, to essentially swing through, much like with a lance, and let the weapon extract itself. But you can't do that on foot. Now, imagine someone using one of these on foot. These are sometimes shown, incidentally, worn on the left hand with a tolwar or a farangi or some other type of kanda, other type of sword, in the right hand. So sometimes these do seem to perhaps have played the part a little bit like a left-hand dagger or parrying device. But they were also shown in the right hand and used with a shield or dal, buckler, in the left hand as well. So they were used as a primary weapon and a secondary weapon. Now, if you stab someone with one of these, because your wrist is totally locked in there, it's very strong, very good protection, but if you ran someone through, as in the movie Willow, incidentally, if you ran someone through with one of these, it's quite difficult to get it out again. You don't have any play of the wrist to enable you to do that, and you can't move, you can't change the angle around much to get it out. So it's not terribly practical to do that. So in a sense, you could say that because the wrist is locked, you're pretty much committed to cutting and not getting stuck in the target. Because if you get stuck in the target, your whole arm becomes quite locked in and quite rigid. Right, to finish off, I'm just going to mention that book that I talked about. So, whilst I've been a fan of Indian weapons for many years and been collecting things and looking in museums like the Wallace Collection, the British Museum, the Stibbett Collection, various other places that have famous Indian weapons, I've handled a couple of the swords that are attributed to Tipu Sultan, for example, one in the Stibbett Collection. And whilst I've been a fan of these things for a long time, I've often noted in my videos and in discussions to people that there are really few books to refer to, certainly in English, and as I understand it in India as well, this is the situation. There aren't many good books to refer to if you want to learn about Indian weapons. You just kind of have to learn on the job. But there is now a really good introductory book. Now, it's not colossally detailed, but it's a really good overview. It's by Dr. Ravindra Reddy, as you can see here, and it's called Arms and Armour of India, Nepal and Sri Lanka. This is available right now on Amazon. I'll stick a link below this video, obviously, to this book. Dr. Ravindra Reddy is a doctor of, I think, psychiatry, if I remember correctly. Yes, a psychiatrist and a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society, and is essentially a long-time collector and student of many aspects of Indian history, but particularly, at least in recent years, of Indian arms and armour. And he does have a section about the pata. For anyone who says that should be called a dan pata, you'll notice he calls it a pata. And you'll see that the proportions are much like the example I've just shown here. He does indeed note that, well, I'll read it out. The pata is a uniquely Indian sword that closely associated with the Maratha kingdom during the 17th and 18th centuries. It's best described as a gauntlet sword. The pata has a long and broad double-edged flexible blade, and they were either European imports or locally made. So this all agrees with everything I've said in previous videos, and it goes on. I won't read the whole thing. And there are also, as you see, there's some interesting examples given there, and we see this when we start looking in the artwork of patas used by various rulers, Indian rulers, and fighters of these, particularly the 17th and 18th centuries. It's still around in the 19th century as well. And you'll see that this person here, that is a portrait of Shivaji, and the pata is actually on their left hand. Let's just see if I can get the thing to focus on the page rather than me, and you'll see the pata is actually there on his left hand, and he has a Farangi sword for his right hand. So anyway, there we go. Arms and Armour of India, Nepal and Sri Lanka by Ravindra Reddy. I highly recommend it. Really, really nice book. Beautiful illustrations, amazing examples, some of which actually belong to people I know, arms dealers and collectors. And some from museums as well, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, for example. And the pata is a really interesting weapon and very unusual within the world of the development of weapons, a very kind of unique design and particular to India. And I think the use of it and the evolution of it and its place in history is a very interesting thing to look at. Anyway, order Dr. Reddy's book if you can afford it, and I highly recommend it, and I will see you guys for a new video really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.